Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Mind Blown Zone, episode 14. This one is called Do Viruses Exist? This is going to be such a great podcast, tackling one of the biggest, I would say, unproven theories in, well, all of reality. And the way we're going to do this is Brad is going to walk us through all the shade, all the doubt that exists for the argument against viruses. How are you, Brad?
I am fantastic. And how about yourself?
Oh, yep. Also good. Feeling great today. Really excited about this one.
This is going to be a fun one. This is Brad's baby, and I'll just start running with it now. This is something that obviously got kicked off with, early in the COVID scare. So we're talking, January, February, March of 2020. And I'll be the first one to admit that I, along with 99.999% of humanity, also believe that viruses existed. Well, why wouldn't we believe that?
Me too.
I had some questions about AIDS and polio. There'd been some stuff circulating in the truther community for years that there was some shenanigans going on with those, but who would have ever suspected, a flu virus or a smallpox virus was nonsense? Certainly not me.
Right.
Anyway, so this kind of all got started with a podcast that was done by David Icke, and he was talking about this doctor who had done a bunch of research, and he couldn't find any proof in any of the scientific papers that COVID existed, or SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. So that's what kind of got everything going. Mm-hmm. And from there, we were introduced to Dr. Lanka, who I'll talk about a little bit later in the course. But basically, as soon as I came to my own conclusions and recognitions, I started telling other people. Right? At first, it was, well, there's a lot of questions about this. I'm not so sure. And then it evolved into, oh, yeah, there's no proof that viruses exist. And, for the next year and a half or 2 years, I was just barraged with, looks of astonishment or derision or absurdity from other people. And, probably more than anything else, it was just most people had no curiosity about the subject. They just immediately said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I'm not interested in
experience for me.
Right? I don't care what you have to say. Are you a virologist? Are you a doctor? Well, then I don't trust you. And that's pretty much what I got. So I wanted to start this podcast talking about what I call insta-denials, just, immediate initial reactions to hearing for the first time that viruses don't exist, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, the big one that everybody agrees on, everybody has had this experience that they've either caught or they've passed a virus to a family member, a friend, a coworker, something. Most people have lots of stories like that. Mm-hmm. And, it's because of that idea this is a good example of a belief imprinting, right? That, we were 5 years old and, our brother got a virus and then we got it and, mom or dad explained that this is what happened. So that's a really early belief imprinting situation. But when I explain this to people, the reason they immediately think I'm crazy is because there's no possible explanation other than a virus for these situations. So that's really the quickest one. Another one that I got a lot and still get a lot after I maybe explain something for 2 or 3 minutes, and I still don't know why I get this one, but a lot of people say, so what are you saying, that people don't really get sick? And I don't understand.
Right. What, you think I'm just imagining it?
Yeah, if it's just an imaginary disease, and of course not. Nobody who doesn't believe in the existence of viruses doesn't believe that people get sick. Of course we get sick. There's no question about it. So I just want to get that one off the table, is that the symptoms, the nausea, the vomiting, the stuffed up nose, the headache, whatever, the diarrhea, whatever goes with it, totally real. But the question is it caused by this invisible microorganism called a virus? Mm-hmm. So, of course, I kind of touched on this. The other thing that gets people to dismiss me is that, they say there's no way that all the experts, doctors, virologists, etc., could all be lying. And I agree. Right. There is no way they could all be lying. Right? Somebody would have said something, it would have gotten around, and we would have corrected our medical system. Right? So we have to get past that one, that they've all been lied to. Virtually all of them have been lied to, just as we have been lied to, is the stance that I want to make sure I make clear. Your family doctor isn't lying to you. He or she got taught what all the other family doctors got taught for the last 100 years plus.
Right.
So we got that one to get through. Then we got blind trust and authority aspect of things, where immediately they say, well, are you a doctor? Are you a virologist? And if I'm not, which I'm definitely not, then they don't care what I have to say because they trust the experts. And either their family doctor or one of the personalities on the internet that talks about this. And very few of them want to talk about this. I should add that there are many popular voices out there in the alternative healthcare community that have been, gained a lot of acceptance and popularity these past 3 years, talking about their questioning of the COVID narrative and the jabs and all the rest. But they're still of the mindset that viruses exist, but they don't want to talk about it. So an interesting little side note there. I touched on belief imprinting. Herd mentality is the other thing, is that, there's a certain amount of people that say, well, I just don't know. And you're making a lot of good points, but until more people start talking about this and agreeing, I'm just going to stick with the popular narrative. And that's really a classic example of herd mentality. And it's understandable, it's tribalism. So the next point then is this somebody would have spoken up by now argument, which is a reasonable, rational argument. And I, of course, want to just throw out a few people that have spoken out. Now, they have been repressed, suppressed. Their books are out of print and nobody knows their names. But there was a woman named Ethel Hume who wrote a book called Béchamp or Pasteur back in 1920. And she makes a really good case that whatever Pasteur was working on was just a bunch of nonsense. And she's got, hundreds of doctors that say so, that she quotes in her book. And then another woman named Eleanor McBean came along, I think in mid-1950s. She wrote a book, I can't remember the name of it, The Poisoned Needle it was called. And she's got a whole, just list after list after people questioning, her book's about questioning the efficacy of vaccines. But within that, they're all questioning this, viral disease thing in that book. So people have spoken out. They're just pushed down. And then there's another guy, a homeopath by the name of Dr. Alonzo Shadman, who said that, after all his research and conclusions, he's wondering, whether the virus even exists at all. And that's, just an interesting quote from a doctor. And then, of course, we bounce up to Stefan Lanka, who was a virologist. He now doesn't want that title attached to him, but he was probably the first person in modern times to actually scientifically show that what's going on here is not on the up and up. And he's been doing it for probably 20 years. And I'll talk about his measles experiment a little bit later here, but he's the guy that got this whole thing going in 2020 when the COVID thing kicked off. So those are some of the main objections that I get. Can you think of any other, Matt, that have come along your way?
Well, I find that it kind of comes down to all the things that you've just mentioned, all come together in an accusation towards the person suggesting that viruses don't exist, that person must be stupid. Right, that they must not know anything about the scientists, and the only explanation is that they're stupid. Right. So it's just like this instant dismiss, like, you are just an idiot. It's like, no, I know your whole, I know your whole thing better than you. I know both models very, very well, and I'm trying to bring you something new that you don't know. And it's like, well, I won't consider it because you're stupid.
Yeah, either that or I have some kind of agenda. Like, people have accused me, what's your agenda here exactly? Why would you try to convince somebody of this? There's maybe a little bit of that in the background. And, probably what's dominating the subconscious, of these people is the possible idea that there's some institutional corruption going on, right, at the highest levels. Right. And that's bothersome to think that could be true. And as we'll go along here, I'm going to try to point out that it's not only likely true, it's definitely true. And it's an unfortunate to have to deal with that when you hear it for the first time. But here we are, and I want to get all this good stuff off my chest so that I can point people to this, say, here are my thoughts.
Right. You've been waiting a long time to,
Yeah,
so I bet you're happy to finally do it, eh?
definitely want to just get it over with. Another thing I'd mentioned here real quick is, everybody seems to think, well, then if that's that institutional corruption, and I mentioned it earlier, then other doctors got to be in on it. And it's not the case. As I mentioned before, they're fooled just like the rest of us. They have 8 billion things they got to learn in medical school. They probably spend, a couple weeks in one semester, and all their job is to memorize mountains and mountains of data that get thrown at them from the textbooks, right? They're not sitting there critically thinking about, well, how did they do this experiment? And are you sure they did this one right? It just doesn't cross their mind. They're there to cram information in and spit it back out on their tests so that they can get their degree. So they're definitely not in on it. But very, very tiny few are in on it. And I guess the last thing I wanted to mention here was just that, now that you've heard this and the rest of this podcast, hopefully, you're going to probably want to go and do your own research. And unfortunately, of course, the mainstream publications, Google searches, journals, right, any popular search engines, you're going to get the same information back. And unless you understand what's going on, which I hope to try to explain here today, you're going to instantly look at one or two papers. Well, here's a paper that proves that viruses exist, so I'm done. I'm shutting off this idea of the possibility. And that's a mistake. It's a big mistake. Hopefully I'll give enough information today to suggest as to why it's a mistake and give you some resources here at the end to utilize to go see what I'm talking about. All right.
Sounds great.
So next thing is the history of the term virus. So the Latin original definition is a toxic, noxious, or poisonous substance. So it didn't say anything about a germ or anything, or a microorganism or anything like that. And then from the period, roughly kind of the Pasteurian period, I call it 1880 to 1925, it became a presumed microbe that's smaller than a bacteria that was unable to be seen with their current technology, their light microscopes. So they couldn't see anything. They just assumed that there was something there because they had already been blaming bacteria, blah, 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 blah. So what they effectively called it was a filterable agent or a filterable form of bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
And that became...
I liked what you said to me just the other day. I'll just reiterate it. You said they'd seen other bacteria. They'd seen infection. They'd seen with microscopes bacteria. And they'd said, okay, small things, germs, cause symptoms. And then they found other people with symptoms, but they couldn't find the bacteria. And they said, well, there must be something so small that we can't see it, but we'll see it eventually. Right. And then that was it.
That was their reasoning. And that's reasonable reasoning, right? Who can criticize that? It makes sense that because they
makes sense.
Presumed the bacteria were causing the problem, maybe they're smaller bacteria. So no real critique so far. And in fact, really, their position is the most sensible of all. It gets worse. The closer we come to this period of time, the more strange and inane and nonsensical it gets. At least these guys, had a test tube or a petri dish or whatever with fluid and unknown contents. They had something. Right? This is the thing. In here somewhere is this deadly virus. That was their assumption. So, the concept that we later would come to, and I wanted to, speak about Royal Rife. I may bump ahead here because Royal Rife is an amazing, super genius. And I love all the work that he did. He invented all these amazing, what we now call dark field microscopes. I mean, the guy was like ahead of his time by 100 years. And I want to just make this clear is that he was using the definition at the time. People say, well, Royal Rife saw him in his dark field. He saw something else that we'll talk about in another podcast called microzyma somatid. We don't have time to do that one today, but he called the things he saw viruses because that's what people called these small little things. That was what they thought they were. So I wanted to make that clear because I'm a big fan of Rife. It's a shame what happened to him and what they did to him. But I wanted to get that out there. So I think I covered most of this. Yeah, microorganisms were what they would call them sometimes, but this was the virus, smaller than the bacteria. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So they also disregarded this pleomorphism idea, which there's been proof of it for over 150 years now. But for whatever reason, the establishment medical institutions won't accept it as a possibility. And all that means is that there are these changing forms. These bacteria come from these small little tiny things, and they morph into the different rods and staffs and round things and spherical things. Then they get different names. But a lot of these guys, including Rife, saw that this was happening. So I don't want to diverge off into that. Do you think I need to make any clarifying statements on that, Matt, or can I keep rolling?
No, I think we're fine here. We're kind of at like small things, identified, correlation, symptoms. That's where the science is kind of at this point.
Got it. Perfect. So I think it's in, shortly thereafter at some point. It's not clear, but the definition of virus is then changed again. And this is the modern day definition, which is that a virus is an infectious microbe consisting of a segment of nucleic acid, which is either DNA or RNA, surrounded by a protein coat. That's the new modern definition of a virus.
Right.
And just to be clear, if you scratch some dead skin off your arm, you're going to find a lot of segments of nucleic acid surrounded by a protein coat. Just to be clear.
Mm-hmm.
We're all made of DNA and RNA, right?
Mm-hmm. And you'd be hard pressed not to find such entities in any symbol.
On the top of your windowsills that you haven't dusted in a while, you can find it just about everywhere. There's life. So moving on now, I want to jump into Louis Pasteur only because I've read a great deal about him. And, it's just going to be a quick coverage of him, but, he was described by his, top professor as a mediocre chemist at best. He never received any education or training in medicine or biology of any sort. And he got into the mix when it became profitable to deal with all the French winemakers and fermentation and this sort of thing that was going on in France when he, came of age. He was just, he was just wrong about everything. I wish I could say, yeah, he did figure out some important things, and here are his contributions to medicine and science. But unfortunately, he didn't. He actually stole all the ideas that he's credited for today from his contemporary, a man by the name of Antoine Béchamp. And Béchamp was just such a quiet, humble, he was like a real scientist. He didn't want any publicity. He didn't want any celebrity. And he just kind of let Pasteur do it.
Just to be clear, how does the scientific community regard Pasteur now? Is he regarded as some father of something or inventor of something?
Well, yeah. he's in virtually every book about history that has anything to do with science. There are, I think, 37 infectious disease institutes around the world called the Pasteur Institute. And he is
right. So he's a
modern hero.
Infectious disease modern hero, like father of science in that field.
He's the man. No one tops him. And of course, we all drink pasteurized milk today because of his work. They think that the bacteria in the milk can make you sick.
Right. Okay.
Also not true, but that's Pasteur for you. All right, so let's see. And you don't have to take my word for it. And actually, a university professor did his best to not make Pasteur look bad, but he actually wrote a book based on they shouldn't have been released, but the grandson of Pasteur released his private diaries against Pasteur's dying wishes. And in those diaries, he admits to unethical, immoral practices when, dealing with squirting innocent people with his crazy nostrums. And the most famous event of his life was he set up this big press event where he was going to save some farmer's sheep herd from anthrax. And, he set it up months and months in advance, and he worked on his anthrax vaccine, whatever the heck it was just basically rabbit blood. And as he approached the deadline, when all the press was going to show up, that he's going to go inoculate all these sheep, he knew he couldn't take his concoction to this event because it was killing over half the sheep that he injected it with. So what does he do? some veterinarian, from some other part of France, had also created his own version of a vaccine, and it wasn't killing as many sheep as his was. So he admits he used the veterinarian's concoction, not his own.
Okay. So I'm sorry that I'm not clear on this Pasteur guy, but he must have, it's by the sounds of things you're saying he was some sort of inventor of some sort of vaccine or something. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, he's most famous for his rabies vaccine, right? Which is still used today.
Right. So in the early 1900s, this Pasteur guy supposedly invented some vaccine. He's regarded as like, oh, he's this guy who could stop viruses, right? And you're pointing out the falsehoods in his theories and the mistakes that he's made, right?
Yeah, they're all mistakes. I mean, there's no anthrax. The thing they call anthrax bacteria doesn't make people sick. It's the output or the waste product of those bacteria doing their work, whatever. Really, what they were probably doing, and I can only speculate here, but those bacteria were probably eating the arsenic that the sheep were dipped in to keep off the pests. And this is probably what happened. Can't prove it. Not part of this talk, but this is what his most famous thing in his life was this anthrax sheep vaccination press event. This is where he gained worldwide fame. But today most people think of him as the inventor of the rabies vaccine, which is also, a wasteful, deadly nostrum. So
basically in the historical thing here, we've introduced like there's this idea of vaccines, right? Like it's somehow into this Pasteur guy has brought in vaccines, and now the public believes in vaccinating animals against viruses, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's somebody, Edward Jenner was the guy who really made it famous, but that's not part of this talk. Pasteur is the father of the germ theory of disease, is where I'm going with all this.
Okay.
Right? He's the guy that everybody points to and says, here's the one who figured it out for us.
Right. And certainly at this point, there is no observation of viruses, right? Not even claimed at that point that there's a clear observation, right?
Right. And I was gonna dive right into that section here in a moment. So what we have now in this pre-1900 period and a little bit past 1900 is we have more claims. Now that Pasteur's work has gotten out and about, we have this tobacco mosaic virus story, which is total nonsense. And if you go and look at it, you can see all they're doing is exactly what this filtrate idea. They were just taking these sick plants and they were filtering out the bacteria and everything else. And then they got this, soup of gunk afterwards. And then they took that soup of gunk and they poured it on some other plants, and those plants died. And that's the proof of tobacco mosaic, which a lot of papers still point to as a reference. Like modern day papers point to that one. Mm-hmm. There was 1898 cattle foot and mouth virus. So this is all starting to pick up steam. And I think it's important to point out here is that this whole period, right, between 1880 and 1940, we blame a number of, massive deaths or, pandemics, if you will, on these viruses, and nobody could see it.
Right.
Smallpox, Spanish flu, polio, even rabies.
Yeah.
Back then, right? All these things are blamed on viruses, but no one's ever seen one. So really important, I think, to point out.
Right. So it's basically in the public consciousness now that they're like, oh yeah, all these diseases and stuff and these symptoms that we're observing, people are like, oh yeah, they're all caused by these microscopic things. We never actually seen them, but if you create this vaccine that you don't know anything about and then put it into that, then it stops the supposed virus that we haven't proven to exist, right? That theory has taken hold in public consciousness at this point, right?
Completely. A tremendous amount of fear can be generated based on an assumption, right? A presumption. Right. So that's what, it's not until the 1930s that the electron microscope is even invented. So it's at this point that a few people have seen, little creepy crawly things that no one's ever seen before, or so they claim, right? And it's really not until after World War II where these things the electron microscope start to show up, at universities and research facilities where people can start looking for this alleged virus that's now killed hundreds of millions of people by now.
Well, I think that's really important because people say, oh no, I believe in viruses because there's the proof with the electron microscope, right? But people fully believed in it before that proof anyway. So the people who believe now would have believed before without the proof. So it's not because of the proof. It's really just what the scientific community is saying it. And you're afraid of the viruses, and they say it, and it's just believed, right?
Right, and it's not right to say that the electron microscope provided proof. All the electron microscope provided was they could take pictures of things smaller than a bacteria. Right?
Yeah,
they could magnify 100 times further and see things in the mixture of gunk that were smaller than bacteria. Say, hey, look, here's some little particles and things that we couldn't see until we had this.
Yeah, right. We theorized that there were smaller things than viruses, and here they are. And we take this tissue that is, of an animal or a person with some sort of symptoms, and we observe these small things in the tissue, right? So there you go. It's confirmed. We've confirmed fully that there's contagious viruses that move from one person to another and transfer this illness by the fact that we've observed small things that we couldn't observe before.
That's the right way to say it. Yep, small things. And it should also be noted, since we're talking about this, that the process of making a slide for an electron microscope requires that you destroy and kill the sample. So if there was anything living in it, it's dead after you stain it with the heavy metals and fry it with the electron microscope light. So they're never looking at a process, or they're not looking at anything moving around or something. You don't see the little squiggly attacking another little squiggly. None of that.
Yeah,
can't see it.
Yeah, they're not observing this particle in one entity that's infected, moving out of that entity into another entity and then infecting that. That is not observed. It's just static, small things that are associated, correlated with diseased tissue.
Right. They're just looking at they're looking at death, basically. They're looking at the end result of taking some fluid or tissue from a person who was sick. Yeah, it's right. So hopefully, at this point, we're about, halfway through or so. Hopefully people are starting to see some, there's some questionable stuff, and I haven't even really gotten to the good stuff yet, but this takes us to 1940 or so. But let me back up a little bit and talk about Koch's postulates, or I think correctly said Koch's postulates, K-O-C-H. And these were formulated by the, Pasteur's contemporary in Germany, Robert Koch, or Koch, however you want to say it. And people hear this, that's some deep scientific stuff. No, it's not. It's basic common sense. And I'm going to just really simply say what Koch's postulates are. He says, identify the thing you think is causing the disease in the person who's sick, to remove that thing from the person, and then isolate it, separate it, and purify it from all other things, right? And then take that purified sample that you got from the sick person and introduce it to the healthy person, right? Either make them smell it or drink it or, whatever they got to do to introduce it, and then observe that person getting sick, and then take the sample from the newly sick person and isolate and purify the sample again, so you get the thing that's causing the disease. Right? I mean, it's pretty logical. There's nothing complicated about that at all.
Yeah. Can I even restate it in even simpler terms?
Go for it.
So you would go get your sample. You would identify the virus. You would pluck it out with whatever tool you got. You'd pluck out, hundreds or thousands of these things, and you'd say, okay, here they are in a little receptacle. Okay, here they are. Then we'll go put those in another living entity, an animal or human, and let's see if it develops the same symptoms. Right? That's simple. Like that's the challenge. And has that been done? No,
never.
Why not? Oh, I can't do it. We can't do it.
We're not going to talk about bacteria today, but they can't do it with the alleged cooties virus, nor can they do it with bacteria. And believe me, they tried and tried and tried for at least 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
So today, when a virologist or immunologist or bacteriologist or microbiologist or whatever talks about these are modern scholars have been taught to say that Cox postulates are archaic, outdated, and irrelevant.
Yeah.
And for the few times I've heard
to say,
right, for the few times that I've heard them pressed on it, they just say because there have been newer postulates. Rivers postulates is one example they'll go to, which is similar to Cox postulates, but it's a little less stringent. But even Rivers postulates, they don't even try. Nobody's tried to prove Rivers or Cox postulates since the early 1950s.
All right, then.
To my knowledge, right? If it's out there, we'd all love to see it, but nope, they're outdated. So to me, this is one of the most important aspects to talk about, is that you would think somewhere along the way, even if it was with rabbits or mice or whatever, that somebody would have been able to successfully take this, microorganism, whatever you want to call it, from the sick thing, give it to the healthy thing, and then the healthy thing gets the same disease as the sick thing.
So I would say you arrived at an important point here for that, it's a practical thing that people can do, would be to go to your doctor or, some medical professional with whom you have acquaintance and literally ask them, hey, can you tell me about a time where they actually isolated like the actual virus and kind of got it and then put it in another animal or human and checked if they developed the virus? Are you aware of that ever happening? Okay, watch them struggle. All right, that's a very simple question. See what happens.
One of the problems with that tack now is that there are thousands upon thousands of studies that have been done. Really, it's vivisection. It's torture, where people take various concoctions of who knows what that are in these syringes, and they squirt this stuff into mice and guinea pigs and rats and so forth. And the researchers find that, some of these mice got all sweaty, and these mice lost their appetite, and these mice didn't sleep well, right? So they have these kind of corollary studies where they think they're proving something. And this kind of obfuscates the reality of things, which is that you need to give the mouse needs to get the same disease as the other mice. They all need to have the same thing. And it's what is it? Are they coughing, sneezing, wheezing, diarrhea, whatever it is? So there's that aspect of this that really hides the truth. The other aspect, as I like to say, is that my argument is I can take some box of Cheerios and mix it up with some Coca-Cola and maybe some Cheese Whiz and throw it in a blender, mix it all up, put it in a syringe, and squirt it into you. And I guarantee you're going to have a reaction.
Right.
Your body is not going to be happy because your body runs perfectly. It doesn't want, there's nothing belongs in your sterile environment of your body or your bloodstream. So your body is going to react when you squirt foreign stuff into it. And
and especially not the diseased tissue of another living being, right?
Oh boy. Yeah. Well, that's a whole nother dark rabbit hole to go down. But yeah, this is why those experiments don't hold any water. If you have to inject something to prove something, then you've lost the plot. They should be able to aerosolize whatever their concoctions are, or put it in the water or the food or something. Right? When they have to inject enormous amounts of toxic fluid into these teeny tiny little helpless animals, that doesn't prove anything. It's just absurd to think that it does. It doesn't.
They should be able to isolate the exact things that they say are the viruses with nothing else whatsoever, put them on a tabletop, and then have you put your hand on it, or and then rub your eyes or something like that, or just go down to the tabletop and smell it in, and you get the virus.
Right. We call this normal transmission vectors. So you've got to show that it transmits the way we're told, right? Through the air, through the water, through the food, through the surfaces. Right. There's a million ways they could do it, but they never do. It's always this injection problem.
Yeah, we injected it with like rotting tissue into a person. It was like, you're injecting me with rotten tissue? Oh my God, there's rotten tissue in me. That's good.
There's a really interesting argument out there, and I can't articulate it well, but it suggests that your body violently reacts to foreign DNA when it gets into it because it doesn't recognize it, so it really feels under attack. And in all every vaccination that's ever been concocted, it's loaded with foreign DNA. And I'll talk about that in a second, what's in these viral culturing mixes. So
Okay.
hopefully that makes a lot of sense. I got a quick section here again on Royal Rife and Gaston Naissons. Both of these men, just really briefly, both invented some fantastic technology, and we call it dark field microscopy today. And what they were able to do with their inventions is see living tissue, living bacteria, living whatever, smaller than bacteria, things, swimming about in fluids. They could look at it for hours and hours and days. But for some reason, the American Medical Association and the Canadian Medical Association and all of these top-level establishments decided to ruin both of these guys' careers and really their lives, and attack them for trying to help people. In Rife's case and Naisson's case, they were helping people that had cancer diagnoses, and both of them helped a lot of people. But for whatever reason, the establishment didn't like what they were doing. So had these men's lives not been destroyed, we would have known what everybody is starting to discover today about these viruses and bacteria. But keeping their technology away and only using the electron microscope has allowed this deception to go on for darn near 100 years now. Okay, make sense?
Yep.
All right, so I'm going to bounce right here to 8, just because I did 7 already. So one of the most amazing and important things to understand, and I can't stress this enough, is that nobody has ever been able to find a virus in the fluids or tissues of a sick person. Can't find it. Can't stress that enough. They claim that there's not enough virus in the sample for them to be able to find it. In other words, just take that, whatever, mucus or urine or blood or whatever from the sick person and look at it under a microscope and find a virus in there. Can't do it. They've never been able to do it. So they don't even try. Anyway, go ahead.
So I imagine someone listening at this point would say, what? Surely they have, right? Surely they have,
right?
Right?
That's right. And the answer is nope. They can't do it. They've never been able to do it. And this is why, from this post-World War II era, leading into the early 1950s, virology was almost dead. There was no such thing as a virologist, and there was nothing to study because they couldn't find them. They couldn't find anything. So they needed somebody to rescue this field, and a guy came along by the name of John Enders. I believe he's got a Nobel Prize.
Let me ask you again. If you're saying, okay, they can't find them, but if someone goes to Google and they look up virus and they see a picture, right? And it's like, okay, there's a virus, right? Well, where were those pictures taken, if not in the tissues of a sick person?
I'm getting to that. That's the next.
Okay, you're getting to that.
Modern virology section.
Okay.
A quick side note is that if you Google this, you'll find funny little claims that, Arctic researchers found ancient viruses in ice core samples from 20,000 years ago, or they found it in permafrost that, unfroze from 50,000 years ago. Well, apparently they claim they can find viruses in this, but they can never find influenza or polio or HIV or SARS-CoV-2. They can't find it anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just give you this as a side note too. So Dr. Tom Cowan and Andrew Kaufman were on a call. They talk about this frequently with one of the lead virologists in Wuhan. And it was a kind of an open Q&A. And Dr. Kaufman asked, well, since it's so hard for you guys to find these viruses in the samples of a sick person, well, what if you took 10 people's, fluids and threw them into a vat? And could you find one then? And the guy said, no. The virologist said no. He said, how about 100 people's fluid samples? Mm-hmm. No. How about 1,000? No. How about 10,000? And then the guy stopped answering the question because he saw how ridiculous it was getting. But this is what they've been taught. Go ahead.
That's just funny.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say something. So this is the story. Either there's not enough there to find or they're too hard to find. So along comes this guy named John Enders. And like I said, he's famous for working with Jonas Salk, who, is an atheistic eugenicist that invents the polio vaccine, and that's what he's famous for. And he wrote another book about how only people with high IQs should be able to survive, and they should look for ways to, eliminate low IQ to better the species. So there's a little taste of,
He sounds like a great guy.
Great
I'm being
guy.
sarcastic,
Great
just in case anyone didn't pick that up.
Indeed you are. So anyway, Ender's working with this guy. They're working on the polio virus. And in the process, he comes up with this methodology. And today we call it viral culturing. And what he does is he takes, I'm just going to explain it really simple. You don't need to understand this to any depth. He takes, for whatever reason, they use green monkey kidney cells, which is just strange on its face when you first hear it, as this sample that the bacteria or the viruses can attack. They take this sample, they put in something known as FBS, or fetal bovine serum, which is basically the amniotic fluid that they suck out of a calf sack after the mother's been slaughtered. And they use this to feed that monkey kidney tissue. And then they pour on what's known as an antibiotics. And it's there's a bunch of different ones they choose. Ironically, they're all poisonous to kidney tissue, hepatotoxic, which is in and of itself a little bit even more curious. Now, they claim that the reason that they put the antibiotics onto the monkey kidney cells is to kill any potential bacteria that are there. So to sterilize them, in other words. That's their excuse for doing this. And then after all this is done, this is the viral culture cooking, then they take the fluids or tissue fluids from a sick person. And in John Ender's case, he took a little boy who had measles and he had some of his fluids. I think it was urine. And he pours this into the mix, this viral culture we got going. And they wait a few days, and the tissue of the kidney cells starts to degrade, deteriorate, fall apart. And they claim now cytopathic effect, which just means the death and degradation of the cell. And they claim that there were viruses in the boy's urine who had measles, and that's what did it. That is viral culturing, and you don't need to understand much more other than what I'm going to explain next. Any questions about that, Matt?
Oh, only that, could I please even restate it with more humor and shade cast upon it? Okay, so, this was, I don't know whether he received the Nobel Prize for this one or he received it for something very similar, but there were supposedly some people who had measles. I've read the entire paper for this. I'm not naive and just saying stuff. I read the entire paper word for word. There are some people that they got like rashes and stuff. They're like, these people have measles. Okay, so let's test it and see if we can get the virus, find the virus, right? They're supposing there's a virus, okay? So they get some of the tissue, right, from these people. They take it from their rectum, from their saliva, and they're like, okay, so this probably has the virus, yeah? And then they take that virus and they put it in the concoction that Brad was talking about, right? A concoction of antibiotics. They had a few different samples, one with like monkey kidney cells, one with human cells, and a few different options, right? And this culture that they can supposedly grow the virus, right? So they put it all together, right? Cells, the bacteria, and the supposed diseased tissue, right? And then they let it rot for days and, mix in with the bacteria, which is the antibiotic, which obviously is killing everything there. And then after a while, they look at it and they look at it under a microscope and they go, look, there are circles with lines coming out. And they get a pencil and they draw it. And they're like, yeah, small unidentified things. So, yep, well, that just proves that there's a virus. Now, here's another part. The reason they use the kidney cells, well, it's because they also did it with human cells, as I said, but they didn't observe anything, right? So they're just like, I don't know, it works with the kidney cells. You can see small things with squiggles coming out of it. That confirms viruses. So anyway, here's a Nobel Prize, and that is literally it, okay? And every single belief in viruses is just resting on that as a foundation, and all you have to do is go look at the paper and read it for yourself and go, what is it? Huh?
Right.
What? They just drew a little sketch and said that's a virus? Wow.
Right. He didn't win the Nobel Prize for that. He won it for something else that I think had to do with polio. But this paper lasted To this day, this still stands as the basic paper for this type of proving, yep, viruses exist. Now, what's also important in this 1954 paper is that what we criticize the virologists of today for not doing, John Enders actually did. He ran a control experiment where he did not, he changed the parameters to see if he could get the same results or if the results would be different. And in his control experiment, he got the same results as the main experiment. But he basically proved that there could have been something else that was causing the cytopathic effect. He didn't go any further with it, try to narrow it down. That happens in 2021 when Dr. Stefan Lanka does this viral culturing experiment, and he leaves out the virus completely, the fluids of a sick person, but runs through their procedure in the same way. Other than that, he gets the same results. He gets cytopathic effect. And so today you'll hear most of them just claim that, it's almost certainly the poisonous antibiotics, which antibiotic means against life. And so when you pour a poison, no less a kidney poison, onto kidney tissue, it's going to kill it. And that's in short, this is what's happening. And this is another problem. If you go and try to go on a PubMed or look for papers, you're going to find all these papers that use this exact method and you'll see in their footnotes, they refer to the Enders viral culturing technique, and they all claim they got viruses, and not one of them runs a control experiment. And a control experiment is what you described. It's let's test this to make exactly sure that it's this, what would happen if we used the urine from a boy who didn't have measles? Would we get the same results? That'd be a control experiment. And of course, you would get the same results. What would happen if we put no urine into it? The fluid from a sick person? That'd be another control experiment. So they don't run any of those, even though Enders did, and it's in his paper. So that's head scratching.
Right. So what you can conclude from this is that, medical establishment is doing what they always do, which is just observing effects and then just going, so therefore the cause is exactly what we theorized a long time ago. But what they're observing is they just create death, right? They kill these cells, and then they observe rotting, dying cells, and there are things there, and they say, see, sickness and things that we don't identify. So virus. There you go.
Right.
And that's all that's happening.
That's the answer to your question from 15, 20 minutes ago. Well, what happens when I Google it and get a picture of a virus, right?
Yep.
They take pictures of the little dots and squiggly marks that are the result of this culturing process. And as the guys were saying today, they use the very scientific point and declare method for proof, right? They say,
declare.
Look, put a little red arrow and point to a couple of little dots and say, there they are. There's the viruses, without any proof at all. Nobody then purifies those viruses or those dots and, then feeds them to a healthy subject and gives the healthy subject the same disease. That part never happens. So good times. So those are all your pictures on the internet. By the way, most of the pictures are actually just that. They're images. They're CGI. So they're drawings. It's pretty rare when they show an actual electron microscope photograph. Anyway, so around 2000, I don't know, a few years before or after, this, the genetics thing starts getting really popular, and the Sanger sequencing starts to take hold, and people may call it genetic sequencing, metagenomic sequencing, Sanger sequencing. Then the name doesn't matter. They're all doing the same exact thing, and I want to make this really clear. So for everybody else in the world who's studying whatever you want to name, tadpoles, corn, humans, flies, doesn't matter, bacteria, they all do the same thing. They take a fully intact genetic sequence of the thing they're studying. I make this clear. So it's already fully intact, and they take it and then they slice it up and study it and do experiments. What happens if we configure this gene to connect to that gene? And you know what I mean? That's what they're doing. Taking the fully complete thing, because we can go find a fly or a frog or a piece of corn. There's no question that those things exist. They start with a fully intact sequence of that organism's DNA, and then they cut it up and study it. That's what sequencing means in the genetics world. Everybody else is doing that except for our friends, the virologists. So their problem is, of course, that they can't find a fully intact genetic sequence for a virus, ever. They can never find it. They gave up looking a long time ago. Nobody goes looking for it. So what they do is they take the, bronchial lavage fluids of a sick person, or the urine or the blood or whatever, and then they pour it into their machinery, and they find millions and billions of little broken teeny strands of RNA, basically dead cells, what we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the skin on your arm, just little fragments of what once was part of a full cell. And they take these and then they assemble them into what they believe a virus is. They don't have a virus sample to start with, but they have programmed into their software, this is what we say a measles virus looks like, or a SARS-CoV-1, or a SARS-CoV-2. What they do. And then they tell the machine, out of all these billions of strands of RNA, assemble something that looks like this. Right?
I'm sorry, that's hilarious.
This is the new way viruses exist. That's right.
Oh, dear.
That's exactly how it works. And again, they're pressed. Well, how come you guys never find a fully intact virus? And all of that, right? All that fluid. You can't find one sample of a fully intact virus? Nope, can't find it. And you don't have any questions about that? No. We were taught that this is the way you do it. So this is the way we do it. As hard as it is to prove, folks, this is what's happening. This is exactly what's happening out there. And it's, you scratch your head. It's astonishing. So this is a modern way to prove a virus is either the monkey kidney cell killing the monkey kidney cells, or assembling a bunch of RNA that we don't know the provenance of, right? We don't know where it came from. Could it have possibly come from the human that you took the sample out of? Well, yes, could, because RNA and DNA, it's all the same for all of life, right? So you can't tell the difference between a little teeny tiny chunk of human RNA and a little teeny tiny chunk of carrot RNA, right? If it's just a little teeny piece, it's all the same. It's only how it gets assembled and, how the amino acids, or sorry, the, not the amino acids, the TGCA connect together, that's what makes a piece of corn versus a human.
Right. So all blocks are the same.
Right. So they could very well be assembling just little pieces of dead human cells, RNA.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that's what we say they're doing. That's all they're doing. And just to give a reasonable metaphor here, imagine a library, and you go in there and you take the whole libraries, all the books off their shelves, and you shred them all, right, down into little teeny tiny fragments. And then you task me with going in there and, reassembling Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, for example. But
even if it wasn't there in the first place, right?
That's right. Even if that book wasn't there, I can go in there and get all the letters and words that make up Romeo and Juliet from all the shredded books in the library.
So it was there.
Right. That's it. That's exactly right. This is what they're doing.
Absurd.
Okay. That's what they're doing. All right. So what do we got next here? The controversy. So if you go out and look for some articles today, you'll find a lot of people discussing whether or not viruses are dead or alive. This is a classic example of what I call a downstream argument. We're going to have millions and millions of pages written on a fight that they're fighting over, something that hasn't even been proven to exist yet, if you can imagine that.
Well, of course I can. I mean, they're trying to talk about COVID, like whether COVID virus was a natural virus or it was created by this country or that country in a lab, man. And it's like, wait, have you confirmed that viruses exist and cause disease in the first place? No.
Right.
No, of course they have. Right.
Right. And so, let alone the argument that, wait a minute. So you're telling me that this thing that has no brain, has no respiratory system or circulatory system, it doesn't eat anything. So it has no will, right? It has no motive, this alleged virus. And yet it somehow wants
to kill you.
Attack you and kill you at once, and it's got this fancy thing where it can trick your cell, and it knows how to connect to the right receptor cell. Like, that doesn't make any sense. None of it makes a lick of sense if you know enough about it. Unfortunately, fortunately, I've learned enough about it to go, oh my gosh, this is insanity. All right, where were we? Google searches. So, I kind of already mentioned all this earlier, so I'll skip past that. This is, to me, maybe the most important thing to mention here for anybody who is going to go do their own research. And, the way I say this is that virology unmistakably and unabashedly deliberately intends to deceive us with the use of one single word that completely throws everybody off the hunt. And that word is isolate or isolation. So we all know what the word isolate or isolation means. Nobody needs that word defined for them. But in the world of virology, it can mean several different things. And the usage most commonly ascribed to their papers, when they say they isolate something, they either mean, one, the swab or tool that they use to extract the fluid or tissue sample from the patient has been isolated from the patient. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's isolation in some of these virology papers. And then the other use of the word,
headphone.
The other use of the word is that the other use is they isolate the fluid or tissue from the swab or tool that they use to extract it. If you can believe that, you can't make this stuff up.
That's isolated from the swab. The fluid's
Right.
being isolated from the tool. How absurd.
You go read these papers, and they'll just boldly and proudly state that they isolated the virus, and now they're on to the next step.
Right. Now, people think, surely it doesn't say such nonsense. Surely it doesn't. But go and check. Don't just say, surely it doesn't. Go and check.
After you read it, right, you'll be blown away that they don't. If you know how to read a scientific paper in virology, you can go look at their methods section, right, which is where they get into the details, and you'll see that they never isolated any virus. Right? Yeah, you could say anything, and that's usually what the abstract says up there. And Dr. Coppin points out that a lot of doctors these days don't have any time at all for reading scientific papers. They've got a half-hour lunch break. And they go and, skim through the latest articles and, headline, scientists in China isolated the coronavirus, and it's on to the next one, right? As far as he's concerned, it's done and he's convinced. It's not until you get into some of these weeds that you see the deception going on. And this word isolation is the deception. And for them not to just come right out and admit that it's deceptive to use that word is astonishing. Tells me a lot of things I need to know. So everybody keep that in mind, that even though the paper says they isolated it, they didn't do what you think they did. End of the story. So here's another piece, and this is what Dr. Kaufman was originally pointing his finger at, rightly so, in the early days in 2020. He was saying he found that that there are these things called exosomes, and that just means outside the body or outside the cell, right? Exo and soma. And right. These exosomes are morphologically characterized the exact same way as a virus. So much so that nobody can tell the difference between an exosome or a virus. Now, how's that for a head scratcher? They're identical.
For example, if you looked up pictures of exosomes on Google and pictures of viruses on Google, you'd see basically the same photo.
That's right. Correct? They're all they all come in little different shapes and sizes and squigglies and this and that.
Yeah, everything's a circular-ish body with squiggles on the outside, right?
Right.
Everything down to that level is circular stuff with squiggles. Yeah.
Right. And keep in mind that when you press something down inside slides, you smash it into a circle if it has any spherical form whatsoever.
Oh yeah.
Come out looking like a circle.
Flattened. Yeah.
Right. Another word they use is extracellular for outside the cell vesicles. Extracellular vesicles. Also, basically, same little circular, squiggly, googly things that nobody can tell the difference between those and viruses. So there's all these things there that can't tell the difference, but we're supposed to believe sometimes they're viruses and sometimes they're exosomes, right? With no way to prove it. So that's pretty head scratching. Now, a lot of people like to talk about bacteriophages as an example that viruses exist, and this is, and also giant viruses. So they'll point to these and say, "Wait a minute, you can't say viruses don't exist because of bacteriophages and giant viruses." No, it's almost like a reverse naming thing going on. I always say it's like calling horses and zebras unicorns without horns. Right? Nobody's proven that the unicorn exists yet. But they can say, well, look, this zebra looks pretty close, and so does this horse. You follow that logic there, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely imagine that given the fact of the horse and the zebra, that, I mean, all it would take is a simple horn. So it's not very far off, is it?
Right. So those are just unicorns without them. And that's kind of what they're doing. Well, that's exactly what they're doing with this giant virus and bacteriophage story. But people love to scream back at us when we claim that no one's proven viruses exist. And they use these two examples. And it's not worth going into what these are in this talk here today. But suffice it to say that it's amazing that they can find these giant viruses and bacteriophages without the use of these, sequencing and viral culturing methods. But they can never find the real viruses that count, right? HIV and SARS-CoV-2 and measles and chickenpox and all the other millions of viruses they say exist. Can't seem to find them, but they can find these two things. So don't let that dissuade you. They are not the same thing, largely because no one's proven that they exist. So here's my next section here. So yeah, so the big guys, and I want to talk mainly about Dr. Stefan Lanka. He's the main guy. He was a virologist, as I mentioned. And one of the most interesting things, I mean, he's the one who really figured this out and showed everybody. So he deserves all the credit. But in 2015, he put out a measles challenge. He's from Germany. And he challenged anybody to bring in a paper that proved the existence of measles virus. And this is really important because some guy eventually took him to court to collect his 100,000 euros. And the guy won in court, the challenger. He brought in 5 or 6 papers, even though the challenger was bringing in 1 paper. And that court case there was no experts, there was no testimony. It was literally up to the judge's decision. He went back in his chambers and read through 5 or 6 papers, and this looks like proof to me. And so he found in favor of the challenger. A big surprise. And of course, Dr. Lanka,
maybe you should have listened to this podcast.
Right? So the media covered that like nobody's business. You can find it in all sorts of media outlets that Lanka lost the case. This virus denier maniac, Dr. Lanka. If anybody goes and looks up his name, this is what they're going to find, that he lost this case and he was proven wrong. But the truth is that he appealed the case, and it was in a higher court, and he got to, of course, question the witness, question the papers, and bring in his own experts. And the judge had to reluctantly concur that no one indeed had proven that the measles virus existed. And so,
boom,
Lanka not only didn't have to pay the guy had to pay his court expenses for putting him through the trouble. And, so people ask, well, why did Lanka choose measles of all the, least deadly, least scary viruses out? He chose the measles because of the 1954 Enders paper. And
right.
Because every single proof of a virus since then always references the Enders paper when they do their viral culturing. So that's why he chose it.
Right.
We said it. If this is suspect, that makes everything else suspect. But he's the man. He does a lot of interesting stuff out there still today. Kind of hard to find sometimes, but always worth a deep dive if you're interested. The other guy I mentioned was Dr. Andrew Kaufman. He appeared on David Icke, and he's got his own channel now. So he's kept the dream alive. He's definitely the most articulate of the group. He's very clear and concise in what he says, and worth a listen if you want to dive deeper into this virus myth. Dr. Tom Cowan is another one, good friends with Dr. Kaufman. He's the one who's keeping the topic alive. He regularly talks about it on his weekly podcasts, and he just, he doesn't want to let it go. Now, there's, a lot of people resisting it in the alternative health space, and he keeps pushing it. He keeps challenging people, and he's always worth a listen. And lastly, there's a Dr. Sam and Mark Bailey. Sam is the pretty face on all the videos. She was actually a media personality in New Zealand prior to for the regular establishment medical system. So she had some experience in making videos and doing content for the public. So hers are by far the most friendly, I call normie friendly videos. She'll do them. She'll do it on the measles and chickenpox and polio, tobacco mosaic, right? She'll just do a 15, 20-minute piece on the absurdities of all of these. So those are really good for people newly introduced to the information. And then real quick, Dr. Lee Merritt is a woman who was, she was a military position. I forget, she was in I forget exactly what she did, but she's come around to, after learning all the stuff that I learned, she's come around to the position that it looks pretty tenuous that viruses exist. And another guy, Dr. Michael Yaden, he worked for Pfizer, I think, was a pharmacologist, and I've heard him at least say that he no longer believes that respiratory viruses exist. I don't know why he thinks other ones do, but I've heard him mention that. So got a lot of doctors, and this is what people seem to need to feel like there might be some legitimacy to this argument. So that's why I mentioned all those names. Let's see here. Closing out. So wanted to add a few resources here quickly. There's a documentary out there called The Viral Delusion. You really should go pay for it. I think it's $7 or $8. There's some free copies flying around, but it's a real good summary of what I talk about today. It was a real nice job. And you see all the people, most of the people I mentioned in this podcast in it. There's also Dr. Stefan Lanka's paper from June 2020, which is what flipped the switch for me, called The Misconception Called Virus. It's a very good paper. It explains, more or less what I explained here today. There's another paper more recent from, I think, September of 2022 from Dr. Mark Bailey. That's Sam Bailey's husband. And it's called A Farewell to Virology. I think that's over 60 pages. It's very complex, very technical. For anybody who wants to get down to the very finest details, that's the paper. And then there's a guy named Mike Stone. He's got a website called Virology. So it's BIROLIEGY.com. And he's got a tremendous assortment of resources, articles, explanations there on the sham known as virology, viruses. So those are the places to go. All of those, Dr. Kaufman, Cowan, and Bailey are all on Odyssey. Some of older Dr. Cowan videos are on BitChute.com, and Odyssey is ODYSEE, by the way, for those of you who haven't seen that. Those are video platforms like YouTube. All of this information has largely been censored on YouTube for some strange reason. So you've got to find it elsewhere. And where was I last? So a good question I get a lot is why there's hesitation from other prominent alternative health personalities that are against the mainstream virus narrative. And it's a good question. I can't speak for anybody else. It does appear that they are certainly not incapable of looking at it, but it seems to me they're unwilling to look into this information and evaluate what's been pointed out. I don't have really any other explanation. I think there's part of it too is they want to maintain some popularity. I mean, I think they have a financial reason to stick with where they're at. No reason to, rustle up their followers and believers. And they don't see any real gain in jumping on board the viruses don't exist story. I don't know. Can you think of any other reasons, Matt?
Yeah. But I'll get to it in combination of why just generally people don't believe, or why people do believe in viruses right after this.
Could be a variety of reasons, but it is frustrating for me. I know a lot of these voices have heard about it, popular voices, especially in we'll call it the anti-vax narrative, who are unwilling to talk about this, publicly. So that should maybe be, bring up some questions alone to say, why don't they get on a podcast with these guys and debate it, discuss it? I don't know, but they apparently don't want to. They've certainly been asked to many times. So that is, and then finally, I guess I'll close with this is, what does make us sick? We've already run over an hour by about 7 or 8 minutes. So obviously it's going to take time. And as I tell Matt often, I wish I could just say, oh, it's not viruses. It's actually schmiruses. That's it. That's the answer.
Smaller thing we haven't observed yet.
Right. Just a tinier little thing. That's the answer. Unfortunately, it's really not even close to being that simple. And each different disease has some different nuances, some different explanations, and it requires a little bit more background information before we get into it. But I promise we will talk about every popular virus out there. I don't know if I'll ever do Zika, but we'll certainly do all the big scary ones that are out there. And, maybe I can get 2 or 3 of them in a podcast, and, maybe a couple of them are going to take a full podcast just to talk about it, because there are a tremendous amount of nuance. So there is, believe it or not, there is another explanation for what we think, what diseases we think are caused by viruses.
Say it ain't so, bro. It couldn't be true.
I know it, as scary as it sounds. That's the case. So we're going to stick around, keep coming back to our podcast, of course, and you'll see them in due time. I'll probably do maybe one a month coming up here in a few months. And we'll pick a week and we'll do, pick a virus. We'll do HIV or, COVID. Everybody wants to hear my COVID version. So that'll be a nice controversial one for everybody, but we'll do them all. That much I can guarantee. You got anything else, Matt?
Well, I want to at least tease that real life events are essentially, and your reaction to them are the cause of the symptoms you experience.
Right.
Fair to put that out there?
Put it out there. I'll say yes. I'll agree to that.
Right. And I'll use that as a segue into mentioning take your power back. You reckon?
That's a perfect segue. It's a perfect segue. Yeah.
We'll explain in future podcasts. Oh, sorry to cut you off. Did you want to mention something?
No, I was just going to say it's part and parcel of understanding diseases is you've got to take your power back.
Right.
The victimhood angle is not serving any of us, and that's part of the explanation. But go ahead.
Right. So this is my perspective right now. The reason people believe in viruses is, invisible, unproven viruses. The reason people so readily believe in this is because you can just dismiss the real cause. All right. You can, instead of accepting what seems to be fact to me, that real life events, real life conflicts, your emotions, your thoughts, what's going on in your life and how you react to things cause your symptoms, right? And once you become, open to that and become conscious of it, and you start to observe the relationship between your experience in life and the symptoms that you experience, you're like, oh yeah, I had that conflict right before that. You notice it, right? And it's not difficult to notice, right? It's literally not difficult. You can perceive it and watch it in real time, and you're like, oh yeah, like I'm literally getting sick, right? According to how that person explained that this emotional conflict can cause sickness. Like I can see it happening in real time, right? I would say, why can't people go into that and feeling that, and why do they have to go to some make-believe invisible virus that they personally themselves have certainly never seen, and just rely on some authority out there to say that it exists, And it's because of this, this disempowerment. Well, when we get disempowered, we get all these things like victimhood, and we're like, it's not me. I'm not causing this thing. It's something out there. It couldn't possibly be my reaction to my real life conflicts. That's not what it is. There's just no way. I'm not looking at that. I'm not considering that. It's something out there. It's a microscopic thing that I've never seen before, and I've never had proven to me that I just believe in. That's the cause, right? And you can see how that's such a disempowered position.
And in fairness, right? In fairness to the vast majority of people, this is what we've been brainwashed, indoctrinated, and trained into believing. There's somebody out there that wants us to be disempowered, that wants us to be fearful.
Right.
So,
right. Which is the top level conspiracy in a way, right? To disempower us.
That's right. That is the goal. If we take back our power, they lose theirs.
Right.
Because they don't have any power. They're just taking ours away from us.
Right. So in Take Your Power Back, what we help you do is regain your ability to face reality, right? To look at your emotional conflicts and go, oh yeah, I feel that now, I see it. And also to reclaim your intellectual sovereignty such that you're no longer just involved in this naive authoritative scientism, as I'm calling it these days, where it's just, apparently the scientist said something and they're credible and they wear lab coats and they talk like this, and what we're observing this in a scientific community at the moment, just to stop doing knowledge acquisition by that way and do it self-experientially, right? So in Take Your Power Back, we introduce you to that way of being, and it's a much more empowered way to live. What do you reckon, Brad?
I reckon that's spot on. And there's a shift that has to take place. Nobody comes to this all at once. So that's the reason for the course, is it takes time to shift yourself from this fear-based, powerlessness-based, victim-based consciousness into a truly empowered consciousness. Take some time.
Mm-hmm.
So we understand that everybody believes in viruses, and we understand that that's what we've been taught for hundreds of years, 150 years or whatever. So you don't wash it all away at once. And my, this podcast today won't wash it all away at once. But in time, as people begin to contemplate this a little bit, it starts to become more and more apparent. And that's the goal of the course.
Right. So, and you can get it at themindblowingzone.com.
That's where it's at. Awesome. Anything else, Matt?
That's the whole thing. Viruses.
All right. Thanks everybody for listening. There are probably a few people working at gas stations and grocery stores and retail shops that that I turned onto this. I appreciate you coming along and listening, along with people that I point to this online. Appreciate everybody listening, and I do hope that we people go and look at those resources. I'll try to get those into the description here, so that we have them for some of the main players that I talked about, and you'll be able to quickly go over and verify for yourself what I've been talking about here tonight. So thanks, Matt, for your inquisitive remarks and questions and comments. And thanks, everybody, for listening. We will see you on the next podcast, number 15.
Right on.
Yeah, Matt?
Well, thanks, Brad. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
See you in the next one.
Thanks, Matt. Bye-bye.